The year is 1453. Spring has barely settled over the ancient city of Constantinople, the wind carrying the salt of the Bosphorus through streets that have known glory for more than 1,000 years. Church bells ring at dawn, as they always have. Merchants open their stalls in the shadow of Hagia Sophia's great dome. Children play near the great Theodosian walls so thick and so tall that generations of attackers have turned away from them in despair. And yet, on this particular spring morning, something is different. On the horizon, beyond the walls, beyond the Golden Horn, beyond the land stripped bare by an army's appetite, there is a sound. It is low at first, almost like distant thunder, but it grows. It is the sound of the largest cannon the world has ever seen. And it is pointed directly at the heart of the last Roman Empire. Welcome. Today, we are going to travel back 570 years and witness one of the most consequential events in all of human history, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II on May 29, 1453. This is not merely a story about a city being conquered. It is a story about the death of an ancient world and the birth of a new one. It is a story about ambition and desperation, about technological revolution and human courage, about the end of medieval Christendom and the dawn of a new Islamic empire. It is, in every sense of the phrase, the end of an age. To understand what happened on that spring morning in 1453, we must first understand what Constantinople was, not just as a city, but as an idea, as a symbol, as the beating heart of a civilization that had endured for over 11 centuries. Constantinople was founded by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 AD on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Constantine chose the location with extraordinary strategic vision. The city sat on a triangular peninsula at the junction of Europe and Asia, surrounded on three sides by water, the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Bosphorus Strait to the east, and the sheltered harbor of the Golden Horn to the north. Only on the western side did the city connect to the European mainland, and it was here that the Romans built the most formidable defensive walls the ancient world had ever produced, the Theodosian walls. Completed in 413 AD under Emperor Theodosius II, were a masterpiece of military engineering. They ran for nearly 6 kilometers across the western land approach, consisting not of one wall, but 3. An outer low wall, a middle wall, and the great inner wall, the latter standing nearly 12 meters high and 5 meters thick, reinforced by 96 towers, each rising even higher. Between the walls ran a broad moat that could be flooded in times of siege. No army in the ancient or medieval world had ever broken through these walls from the outside. They had been tested by Visigoths, Huns, Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Rus, and every one of them had failed. Constantinople had stood while Rome itself had fallen. It had survived the plague of Justinian, the horrors of the Fourth Crusade's sack in 1204, and the catastrophic losses of the Black Death. The city was not merely a military fortress. It was a theological claim. God himself, many of its inhabitants believed, watched over New Rome. The Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, was the city's divine protector. How could a city watched over by heaven ever fall? By the middle of the 15th century, however, this divine confidence had been sorely tested by the grinding reality of decline. The Byzantine Empire, that had once stretched across much of the Mediterranean world, was now little more than a city-state. Constantinople itself, which had once housed 500,000 people, now contained barely 50,000. Entire districts lay in ruins. Fields had grown within the city's walls where houses had once stood. The great empire that had once been the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilization in Europe was now dependent on the charity of Italian merchant cities and desperately seeking military aid from a divided and suspicious Catholic West, the Byzantine Emperor in 1453 was Constantine XI. Palaiologos, a man of genuine nobility and remarkable personal courage, but a ruler who had inherited a catastrophe rather than an empire. Constantine had spent years pleading with the Pope, with Venice, with Genoa, with Hungary, and with every other Christian power he could reach, begging for a crusade, or at least for soldiers and ships to help defend the city. He had even agreed to a deeply controversial union between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, a theological concession so hated by many of his own people that they preferred. As the Byzantine nobleman Laucus Notarus famously reportedly declared, "The turban of the Sultan to the cardinal's hat of Rome, the religious union brought almost no military assistance. A few hundred papal volunteers arrived under a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani. A handful of Venetian ships remained in harbor. And that was essentially it, when Sultan Mehmed II began his march toward Constantinople in the spring of 1453. The total number of defenders inside the city's walls was approximately 7,000 men, soldiers, sailors, and armed civilians combined. Against them, Mehmed would bring an army estimated between 60,000 and 100,000 men, a fleet of over 100 ships, and the most advanced artillery the world had ever seen. To understand the siege, you must understand the man who launched it. Mehmed II was 21 years old when he became Sultan for the second time in 1451. He had briefly ruled as a teenager before being set aside, and from the very first moments of his reign, he made clear that the conquest of Constantinople was not merely a military objective, but a personal obsession, a divine calling, and a political necessity. Mehmed was a man of extraordinary contradictions. He was ruthless and calculating, having ordered the execution of his infant half-brother immediately upon taking power to eliminate any potential rival, a practice called fratricide that he would later codify into Ottoman law. Yet he was also deeply learned, speaking multiple languages including Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Persian, fascinated by history and philosophy, and genuinely captivated by the classical past. He read histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and saw himself as their heir. He was driven by a prophetic tradition in Islam that held that a great Muslim ruler would one day capture the city of Caesar, Kizil-Elma, the Red Apple, as the Ottomans called it, and that this conquest would be a sign of divine favor. For Mehmed, taking Constantinople was not just a military campaign. It was destiny. There was also the practical political reality. The Byzantine Empire, whatever remained of it, sat like a thorn in the side of the Ottoman state. Constantinople controlled the Bosphorus Strait, the critical waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. As long as the city remained in Byzantine hands, it posed a potential threat, a rallying point for crusading armies, a safe harbor for enemies, a symbol of Christian defiance in the middle of Ottoman territory. Constantinople had to fall for the Ottoman Empire to truly consolidate its power over both Europe and Asia. Mehmed began his preparations for the siege with characteristic thoroughness. The most dramatic and consequential of these preparations began in the winter of 1451 to 1452, when he ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly opposite an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This new fortress, built in an astonishing 4 months and named Rumeli Hisari, the Fortress of Europe, gave the Ottomans complete control over the Bosphorus. Any ship attempting to pass without Ottoman permission could now be destroyed from both shores simultaneously. When a Venetian ship attempted to do so and was sunk, the message was unmistakable. Constantinople was being strangled, but the most revolutionary element of Mehmed's preparation was his artillery. Medieval siege warfare had been transformed in the decades before 1453 by the development of gunpowder weapons, but no ruler had yet deployed artillery on the scale and sophistication that Mehmed was planning. He sought out the most skilled cannon founder in the known world, a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine, but finding that the emperor could not afford his fees, had made his way to the Ottoman court. Mehmed paid Orban handsomely and gave him every resource he needed. What Orban produced was staggering, the largest of the cannons he cast for Mehmed, the great bombard that would come to be known by various names. Sometimes called the Basilica or simply the Great Cannon, was an instrument of war unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was approximately 8 meters long. It fired stone balls weighing somewhere between 500 and 600 kilograms. When it fired, witnesses reported that the ground shook for miles in every direction, and that the sound could be heard from across the Bosphorus. There was, however, a significant practical limitation. After each shot, the cannon required more than 2 hours to cool down before it could be fired again, and it would eventually crack from the stress of its own power. But even firing 3 times a day, it could deliver blows to the Theodosian walls that no previous weapon had been able to match. When Mehmed assembled his full artillery train in the spring of 1453, it included not just the great bombard, but dozens of other cannon of various sizes. He had, in effect, brought the future of warfare to the gates of a city still living in the past. In early April of 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before Constantinople and began to take up positions. The sight must have been overwhelming for the city's defenders looking out from the walls. The plain in front of the Theodosian walls filled with tens of thousands of soldiers, their tents stretching to the horizon. The Ottoman fleet, over 100 vessels, gathered in the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, attempting to blockade the city by sea. Emperor Constantine and his commanders assessed their situation with clear eyes. They had approximately 7,000 defenders, Greek citizens, Genoese mercenaries under Giustiniani, Venetians who had chosen to stay, Catalans, and small groups of volunteers from across Christendom. Against them was one of the largest and best-equipped armies in the world. They could not hope to match the Ottomans in open battle, nor could they resist indefinitely. Their only real strategy was to hold long enough for a relief force to arrive either from Venice, whose Senate was debating whether to send a fleet, or from elsewhere in the Christian world. Constantine deployed his defenders along the walls with careful attention to the most vulnerable points. The longest and most exposed stretch was the land walls, the Theodosian walls running along the western side. Constantine himself took command at the most critical section, the area around the Blascherni Palace in the northwest of the city, where the walls were somewhat less formidable than in the main sections. Giustiniani and his Genoese troops were stationed at the Mesoteikion, the middle section of the walls, which Mehmed's intelligence correctly identified as the most likely target for the main attack. The chain that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn Harbor was an extraordinary piece of engineering. A massive iron chain stretched across the harbor entrance, supported by floating wooden logs, preventing the Ottoman fleet from sailing into the harbor and attacking the seawalls from within. As long as the chain held, Constantinople could receive supplies by sea and the seawalls would remain relatively safe. The city's defenders had managed to trap a portion of the Ottoman fleet outside the chain, but Mehmed's naval commanders were unable to force their way past it. This would become one of the siege's most dramatic problems for the Ottoman side. On April 6, 1453, the great cannon began to fire. The sound, by all accounts, was indescribable, a thunder that rolled across the water and could be heard for miles. The stone balls, each weighing hundreds of kilograms, smashed into the ancient walls with catastrophic force. No wall in the world had ever been designed to withstand such an assault. Whole sections of the outer wall crumbled. Towers that had stood for 1,000 years collapsed in clouds of dust and rubble, but the defenders were not helpless. Each night, working by torchlight, The Byzantine and Genoese engineers and soldiers carried rubble and timber and earth to fill the breaches. The cannon had opened during the day. They stuffed barrels with soil, hung bales of leather and wool to absorb the cannonball's impact, built palisades of wood and earth to replace the crumbled stone. It was desperate, exhausting work, but it was working. Each morning when the cannon opened fire again, the breaches had been partially repaired. The walls held. 3 weeks into the siege, Mehmed faced a serious problem. His fleet, anchored outside the Golden Horn chain, had been unable to penetrate the harbor. Without access to the Golden Horn, the city's northern sea walls remained undefended and could even receive supplies from sympathetic Genoese merchants in the nearby settlement of Galata. Mehmed needed to find a way into the Golden Horn. What he devised was one of the most audacious feats of military logistics in the medieval world. On the night of April 22nd, using a system of greased log rollers, Mehmed's engineers transported somewhere between 70 and 80 Ottoman galleys overland, across the hills north of the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely, and launched them into the harbor from the other side. The operation was conducted in secrecy and darkness. Oxen and hundreds of men hauled the ships over the hill, their keels sliding on the greased logs, their sails folded, their oars shipped. By dawn, the Golden Horn harbor held an Ottoman fleet. The city's defenders, waking to the sight, were stunned. It seemed to many like a miracle in reverse, as if God himself had delivered the ships of the enemy into the harbor. One Byzantine chronicler wrote that the sight of the ships sailing on dry land was more frightening than the cannon. Meh had now extended his siege lines to cover the northern sea walls as well. The defenders, already stretched dangerously thin along the land walls, now had to stretch even further. Giustiniani shifted forces from the sea walls to reinforce the land front. The Venetians moved their ships within the harbor to try to contain the Ottoman galleys. An attempt to send fireboats against the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn was betrayed, possibly by Genoese residents of Galata who were trying to maintain their commercial neutrality, and the fireboats were intercepted and destroyed. The opportunity was lost. The psychological impact of the ships in the Golden Horn was perhaps as important as the tactical reality. Constantinople had survived countless sieges in part because its defenders had always believed that God and the Virgin Mary were protecting the city. The sight of Ottoman galleys in the Golden Horn, having arrived by land, bypassing the divinely trusted defenses, began to shake that faith. What did it mean that God had allowed this? Was the city to fall? The mood inside Constantinople grew darker. Through April and into May, the pattern of the siege continued. The great cannon fired. Walls crumbled. Defenders repaired them in the night. Mehmed probed different sections of the walls, looking for weakness. The defenders held inside Constantinople. Supplies began to run short. The blockade by sea was increasingly effective. No relief force appeared on the horizon. The Venetian fleet that the Senate had promised to send was still being debated, delayed, paralyzed by the complex calculations of Venetian commercial interests versus Christian duty. A Venetian captain named Giacomo Cocco attempted a breakout with several fast ships to find the promised fleet, but returned with no news of relief coming. The city was alone. Constantine received reports, some true, some false, of a Hungarian army gathering to the north, of a Venetian fleet finally sailing, of Pope Nicholas V organizing a crusade. He kept these hopes alive among his people, while privately knowing that none of them would arrive in time. He walked the walls at night, encouraging his soldiers, distributing what little food and money remained in the imperial treasury. His situation was desperate, but he bore it with remarkable dignity. Multiple sources, both Byzantine and Ottoman, describe him in these final weeks as calm, composed, and resolute. He had, by all accounts, come to terms with the likelihood of his own death and had resolved to die as a Roman emperor should. Mehmed, for his part, was growing frustrated. The siege had now lasted over a month, and while the walls had been severely damaged in places, they had not been breached in any way that allowed an assault to succeed. The great cannon was doing enormous damage, but the defenders kept repairing. Each Ottoman attack on breached sections was repulsed by the ferocious resistance of Giustiniani's Genoese and the Greek defenders. Mehmed received intelligence, partly accurate, that the Venetian fleet was indeed finally being organized, and that if it arrived with sufficient force, it might be able to break the blockade and sustain the city indefinitely. He needed to force a conclusion before that could happen. In mid-May, Mehmed made 2 diplomatic approaches. He sent an ambassador to Constantine offering terms. If the emperor surrendered the city peacefully, he and all his people could leave with their lives and property. If he refused and the city was taken by force, the result would be 3 days of unrestricted plunder, the traditional Ottoman and indeed the general medieval rule governing conquered cities that refused to surrender. Constantine's response was, by any measure, extraordinary. He acknowledged that he could not prevent the Sultan from taking what God had apparently decided to give him. But he would not surrender the city. He would die defending it. In words that have echoed through history, though filtered through various accounts and possibly idealized in later telling, he reportedly said that it was impossible for him to surrender, that he preferred to die defending his people and his faith. By late May, Mehmed had made his decision. He would launch a final, all-out assault on the night of May 28th to 29th. He would commit every resource he had. He ordered 3 days of rest and prayer across the Ottoman camp. Then began a nighttime procession of lights and prayer that lasted through the night of the 27th, torches and fires lighting the camps from the Marmara to the Golden Horn. The Ottoman army praying and preparing itself for what was to come.